Tom Richards, welcome back to the Lives of the Artists. Your second outing on the show, and it's wonderful to have you here.
That's great. It's great to be back. We were talking about portraiture last time,
I
and I
know
guess
I think we were talking mostly about Velázquez,
yes,
Anthony van Dyck, Rembrandt. Sort of the titans of
exactly.
portraiture. And tonight we are going to talk mostly about the two titans of British landscape
Yeah.
painting, Turner and Constable. We've just seen the show, the fantastic. I mean, I thought it was a fantastic show in London at Tate Britain. What did you think of the show? Firstly,
No, I loved it. I mean, I think which is quite rare for the Tate. It didn't try to say too much beyond putting the paintings up. I thought that they were well lit, they were well hung. The paintings are wonderful. Actually, the real delight of the show, I thought, and the really brilliant part of the curation was how many sketchbooks and smaller work that's often hidden away in kind of archives and other things. I think for a lot of people who love landscape painting, who might, like British landscape painting in particular, a lot of those paintings are quite familiar to a lot of people. But I think seeing the sketchbooks and seeing the studies gave you a real sense actually into their curiosity and, in a funny way, how connected they were as well. I mean, they're obviously so different in some ways, but there are a lot of threads that connect them both too.
yeah, it felt like it was very well curated. There's a real problem with curation nowadays that they try to. It's sort of an extension of their ego. A lot of the times you go to the show and the curator's trying to make a statement, some kind of, it could be any kind of statement, but they're really sort of forcing their ego onto the show. And I felt that wasn't the case with this show.
No.
It was well curated. It was well laid out. There was great information. But one thing, it was packed. I don't know what the day was like when you went there, but the
It
day
was a
I
bit
went,
better. There were some little clusters. I mean, I suppose the only thing I don't like about the exhibition or the premise of the exhibition is maybe I'm greedy, but I don't want to have to choose between Turner or Constable. I want them both.
well, that was going to be the first question. I mean,
Yeah.
when we think about British landscape painting, I mean, let's go to French landscape painting. You think about Monet, you think about Corot, you even think about Vincent van Gogh, even though he wasn't, French. You think about Venetian, Canaletto, Guardi, these greats. But when it comes to British landscape painting, yeah, we really do have these titans that are Constable and Turner. I mean, they are just incredible painters technically, and they dominated the scene for many, many decades. And this show brought their work together, more of their work that's ever been brought together in a show ever before. So it was really, I thought, an incredible thing to see.
Interesting. You just mentioned French landscape painting. So one of the sort of French landscape painter who lived in Italy that was so important for both Turner and Constable was Claude Lorraine.
Yeah.
And I think that's he's one of the first things that really link the two of them together. I mean, so many of their compositions, this kind of, for those of you who don't know Claude Lorraine's work, he was one of the first painters. This is like right at the beginning of the 17th century to really say you could be just a landscape painter. And you tend to find there's kind of a big dark tree, a sort of snaking river that winds its way, or a road that winds its way back, and then some mountains in the distance, and then a sort of luminous but very soft sky behind. And you see that motif time and time again in Turner and Constable's work, and in so many landscape painters' work. I mean,
Much more Turner's work. I
actually,
mean,
even the
Turner's
Hayway,
early work, I felt, was almost, he was really trying to paint like Claude.
yeah,
He was like trying to it's almost pastiche of Claude because he's desperate to get into the Royal Academy. He's
mm-hmm.
clearly very ambitious. He's not from money, and he wants to do well very
Yep.
quickly. So he's sort of really trying to interpret the language that, like you say, Claude has done 100 years earlier.
I mean, I think it's. I mean, even like particularly the British obsession with Claude was enormous to the point where if you go to some of the great gardens of the UK, like Stourhead and Stowe and places, the British were actually really making the landscape in the UK to look like Claude Lorraine paintings. So you'd get a French artist living in Italy who imagined the landscape, and then people remaking the British landscape to look like fake Italian landscapes. And that, his hold over the popular imagination of what a classical landscape was so powerful that, people were remaking, in the southwest of England, all over the country, Capability Brown, to look like sections of or even entire Claude Lorraine paintings. And so, there's no way that Constable and Turner were not, to some degree, under the cloud, as it were. It's a very happy cloud to be under, but under the Claude Lorraine cloud.
And also at the time, Europe was very fashionable. If you go
Mm-hmm.
back to Hogarth, which was 50 years before, he was sort of looking at Europe and making these satirical, jokey, look
Yeah,
at the French kind of jokes. Whereas we just won, the British had just beaten the French in
yeah,
Waterloo, and now the continent was open to travel, and people like Turner could go
yeah.
and go to Venice and go to Rome and go to Paris for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
It became very fashionable.
Yeah.
And a lot of those Turner landscapes did sort of look like Tuscan lit landscapes, didn't they?
I mean, I think Constable really, he was one of these painters that really painted what was in front of him. He didn't travel quite so much. I mean, he moved around a little bit. Obviously, he went to the west of England to Salisbury, but if someone says, a Constable landscape, you might think of Salisbury Cathedral. I think a lot of people think about that area on the kind of Suffolk Essex border where he spent so much of his life, and
There's
so
there's
happily.
there's something very reassuringly Little England about Constable. He just wanted to stay on his patch
Yeah,
and paint it very, very well. And he wasn't really interested. I mean, he would have probably been a Brexiteer, and Turner would have been very much
not.
pro-Europe. But
I mean,
he was very,
Constable
he was sort of
Constable was
very
quite
English, wasn't
religious. I mean, Constable was quite a religious man. He was instinctively quite a, as you say, a kind of conservative, but just a quite a sort of cautious, one foot in front of the other. I think his subject matter was quite radical, and I think what I found interesting looking at both of them was this tension between, as you say, a kind of nostalgia on one hand, and then actually, and then a modernity on the other. So for Constable, there's this modernity in the subject matter of just saying, I'm going to paint quite roughly at times, and I'm going to paint an ordinary landscape with a lot of green. And actually, there's not a lot of green in a lot of 17th century landscape paintings. But let's say on a more on like a social side and a sort of contextual side, he was, as you say, quite conservative. And then someone like Turner, who's nostalgic in a different way. He's looking back at kind of ancient ruins and imagined lands and this kind of romantic, much more connected to sort of certain kind of romantic idea of landscape and the sublime. But then at the same time, he's very connected to, especially later on in his life, to sort of the slavery movement, to certain
he?
sort of trains of thought on the continent. So they both, at times, both modernists and British patriots have tried to claim both artists as their own.
I
And
was sad that
that's a
the
very
slave.
simplistic way to look at it. I think they're both, that's, I like things that don't quite fit neatly into one camp or the other, and I think that's why they're so interesting. Is you can't just say, they're just an old-fashioned nostalgic kind of guy. Constable was painting, carts and horses, but actually the Industrial Revolution was happening. This is actually quite a nostalgic view of a world that was kind of even then was disappearing and was under a great threat. And I think there's that sense in, there's the famous Fighting Temeraire of Turner. They were both very aware that there were factories and mines and other things. And this kind of view of, bucolic rural England was under threat.
Yeah, the dark satanic mills
Yeah.
were ever increasing, and Constable wasn't painting it. Turner was sort
Yeah.
of more aware of that, and yeah, creating paintings like that. They weren't in the show, the Fighting Temeraire, the steam train. What's it called? With the rabbit in front of the train. That
Yeah.
wasn't in the show.
No,
The slave ship wasn't in the show, but that didn't take anything away from the show. There
no,
was
no, not at all.
incredible work there.
I mean, there were a couple of paintings that were exhibited at the Royal Academy in their lifetimes that were about. There's a famous one of Coalbrookdale. I think it's by Lutherby, and it's basically in the background is this, as you say, like the Satanic Mill, this kind of what almost looks like a section of a medieval painting of hell, with the industrial buildings in the foreground of these horses kind of running in the other direction. And so even when they were working, there was this increasing awareness that there was a human, a psychological, even an environmental cost to this industrial movement. Ruskin wrote about it, who was
Yeah.
Turner's great champion. And
It led to Marx writing his
yeah,
manifesto in London, didn't he? He
yeah,
came to London, this city of dark satanic mills, where it was considered the modern city. This is
mm-hmm,
what all cities are going to be like. We have to do something about it to stop this.
yeah,
Let's invent communism because that will work. And it was a it was a very optimistic idea at the time. But let's get back to
yeah,
the exhibition. So you walk in, and there's first thing you see is two portraits one on
Mhm.
the left of Turner and one on the
Mhm.
right of Constable. And the Turner one is very intense. It's him at,
Yeah.
I think, about 20 years old, maybe a bit younger, very intense, staring, frontal. And then you've got this very elegant sort of country
Mhm.
gent portrait
Yeah.
of Constable. And you get to that classic age-old argument of, well, Constable came from money and his father owned a mill and was
Mhm.
relatively wealthy, and Turner's father was a barber and came
Yeah.
from Covent Garden. Do you think that that had a big impact on their upbringing, their way of looking at the world? What did you think about those portraits?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't dwell that long. I don't think they're not great paintings. They give us some sense of who these people are. I mean, for a lot of people, maybe they're most familiar with that film that came out a few years ago, the Mike Leigh film about Turner, where he was kind of reduced to a kind of grunting animal. I thought it was a little bit of a caricature. I mean, he was not an illiterate person. He was particularly interested in kind of Goethe. He read the Romantic poets, and so this idea that he was completely uncommunicative, I think, was probably, it made for quite an interesting caricature in the film. But I thought it took it a little bit too far. But he was,
Well, he did do extreme things. I mean, he
yeah.
sent his mother off to a lunatic
Hmm.
asylum, which she died in. She was sent there by his father and Turner
Yeah.
in 1799, and she died in 1804. So she was there 5 years. It was not an asylum; it was a proper lunatic asylum where
Yeah.
you send crazy people. So what was going on there is very mysterious and hard to know.
I mean, I think there's this great, it happens so often in paint. So, Rembrandt, for example, who, everyone, the paintings are so sympathetic and so full of, people asking for forgiveness, or, he was a more humanistic painter than Caravaggio as well. And yet these people were not actually very nice in many cases. And I think, Sheila Hale, who wrote that good biography of Titian as well, it was very interesting that, when she was looking through his letters, she found out there's very little about aesthetics or philosophy. He was really just interested in money and social
Oh,
advancement.
obsessed with money. Yeah.
And I think, Turner is in this long line of people who's we're so drawn to the art, and it's full of light and beauty and this, sublime vision of nature, of water, of clouds, and, light filled skies. And then when you look at the person, you think, oh, I mean, horrible, not horrible, but, just a profoundly selfish person, which a lot of artists are.
Well,
You
he was
know,
ambitious.
yeah.
Turner was clearly ambitious, and he wanted to. He's still the youngest Royal Academician
Mhm.
that's been accepted. He was accepted at the age of 26. That record's never been broken. He can't get more ambitious than that.
No. And he during his life, for example, he was, he regularly stayed at Petworth and made friends with, some of these kind of grand families. And if he was just grunting away at them, that just wouldn't have happened. I mean, so I thought the film, he was, as you say, he was a difficult person. He was a singular person, but, I'd say a complex person. I think there were many facets to his character. And as you say, there's his own kind of, romantic relationships, his relationships with his family, his relationships with his competitors, if you like, if you want to call it that. The way that him and Constable, and, these apocryphal stories, or possibly true, of kind of the way they behaved at the Royal Academy vernissages, repainting things and deliberately trying to dominate the wall and do down their contemporaries. I mean,
Well, there
it's
is a truth.
understandable.
There is a truth to
Yeah,
that story. But there's also a background to it. So that's the famous painting by Constable, which was in the show of Salisbury
yeah,
Cathedral, which I think won the Royal Academy, the Royal Academy show, the annual show
yeah.
that year. I think it was 1831,
Hmm.
around that time. And it won the show, and Constable famously put it in the most prominent position
Yeah,
in the show. But the backstory to that is that Turner was the only person that year that didn't vote Constable in to become a Royal Academician.
yeah,
So there clearly was tension there.
yeah, absolutely. No, no, I think, as you say, I think he probably felt all his life that he was competing and fighting to get to the, position as an artist, but also his standing in society where he would feel, comfortable, and, in a way, from the things possibly he never did. Um, he wasn't, he wasn't. I mean, whereas, Constable was very attached to the Church of England. He had all these, not just his own upbringing, but the friends he made with sort of Bishop Fisher and so on in Salisbury. I mean, famously on his deathbed, Turner said, "The sun is God."
Mm.
he was very. I mean, I think now people would describe him as spiritual, which I think is not always the most helpful term. But it was that whole moment of nature worship, and Turner was someone who, he loved seeing the light come up over water. He was, strapping himself to the masts of boats and so on. And,
Mm.
you know, he'd paint
That was very
ruins.
much a part. That was very much a part of the age. You know, the
Yeah,
continent was open. They were going to places like Switzerland and seeing these mountains, and they were thinking, well, God must be in these mountains. These are things.
yeah,
British people hadn't seen anything like it. So there was a very British
yeah.
romantic movement that was attached to Turner. Yeah.
No, no, and I think there's also the things that people the poets have been writing up in the Lake District and so on.
Mm.
It's a movement in the UK, but also I think there's this idea of, and it's connected to the Industrial Revolution of, it was a scientific age where people were increasingly questioning the existence of God, and this was a period where people more or less, this idea of nature as a deity was kind of, I mean, not necessarily invented, but became a sort of a normal thing to talk about. I mean, in the schools we both went to, you'd often be told by your teachers to sort of think about, to look at nature, and it's a word that started to be used very casually at that point, and with so many complex meanings. And I think actually both Turner and Constable would have thought of nature as something slightly different. Might have used the word interchangeably. For Constable, it was something that he could see in front of him and perceive and touch. There's that famous thing where he talks about, I became a landscape painter because of slimy poles and bits of moss and very, very tangible small things. And Turner has a view of nature as something much, much grander, almost sort of theoretical or ethereal, that you can sort of sense but you can't quite touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're looking at that early Turner work, it is incredible.
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
amazing.
he's a prodigy, and
Yeah.
for Constable, it takes a little bit longer for him to get
Mm-hmm.
going. But God, Constable can paint too. I mean, they
No,
really can both paint.
I came out of the show thinking, on a really tiny scale, the sketchbooks, I loved both of them.
Mm.
And then actually, I thought my favourite Constable sort of has been and still is, and who knows in the future. But and I thought it was brilliant. They had the 6 foot sketch and the finished painting of the Hadley Castle, the one he made after his wife's death.
Yes, yeah,
Um, and it's such a powerful picture. Occasionally, like the Haywain we're so familiar with, and they had a very big one on loan from the Frick as well, and we're so familiar with that kind of greenness that it's not chocolate box. That's absolutely, he's not a, he's a rough painter. He really puts the material down. It's not kind of
mm.
tree fiddling around. But the Hadley Castle is that romantic vision of the landscape. And then I saw on a 6 foot scale, I think Constable's fantastic.
Mm.
Weirdly, I find the Turners on that big scale, he's almost trying too hard for some of those bigger pictures. But when you get him down to a kind of a meter-ish, some of those smaller, slightly smaller but still significant storm paintings, I think he's at his best on that scale.
Yeah, and
So
the funny thing that I noticed about his earlier work was he was clearly trying to do this really finished stuff to impress the
yeah,
academicians, this ambitious work. But then you look at his sketchbooks at the same time, the same years, it's completely different work.
yeah,
It's almost like that's what he wanted to paint, but he felt like he couldn't quite do that
yeah.
publicly.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting when we teach people at the school, and we're teaching them in a very old-fashioned, prescriptive way. And there are some students who, they really struggle with that type of training. And obviously, Turner was someone who had a very clear sense of what he wanted to say. And you always tell those people, okay, yeah, do your studies, but you have to keep a sketchbook. You have to keep that other flame alive. And you can see echoes of these great artists that people approach, an academic training today, which, for some people they might, see or perceive it as being restrictive. But yeah, anyway, it's just interesting seeing how Turner, in those early years when he's doing, it's that moment of British watercolors where they put these big areas of color and tone down, and then they're kind of this kind of almost graphic style of lines and dots that are then drawn into them to give rocks their texture or buildings their architectural details. And so you can see underneath this kind of these graphic linear detail moments, the kind of what will later be these kind of clouds of color that he'll leave like that, and he won't draw back into them quite so much with smaller brushes.
Well, and you also get the sense that Constable was painting outside more than Turner. I mean, Turner would
Yeah,
take his sketchbooks were endless. He was filling these sketchbooks with
yeah,
watercolors, but he was
and writing
taking
little
those
notes on
sketchbooks.
them and things.
Notes, yeah, black, more
Yeah,
black here, lighter here, fading in. I mean, it was incredible to see these working sketchbooks. But then he would take those sketchbooks into the studio and he would work on these grand
yeah,
scale
transform
paintings
them.
in his studio. Whereas Constable, in those part of the show where you saw his sketching chair or his
Yeah,
painting chair, and Constable was taking smaller paintings out and
yeah,
painting in oil much more than Turner
absolutely.
was. Sort
I mean, they
of,
had one. I thought there was one really good little bit where you really saw the sort of the snail trail of his method Constable. They had a little drawing that was squared up, then the smaller oil sketch, and then the bigger one. And there were subtle changes in the position of some of the boats, and some of the little things that were going on in some of the shadows. And so, I mean, in the obviously the colors and the values he kept from the painting, and then some of the smaller shapes he kept a bit. So he's really using the pencil to do what the pencil can do, which is contours and lines. The drawing in the big oil sketch was actually quite kind of rough, but it had absolutely had the colors, the sense of atmosphere, the sense of space. And so that way he's really he really understood the essence of his materials. He was I don't think he was painting the big ones outside, but the between them the pencil study and then the oil sketch had all the information he needed to. And I think we now live in such a photographic age. The idea that you could remember a landscape that well, having only made a couple of and he could have most of them he was living locally, so he could always just walk out there and go and have a look in the afternoon if he needed to.
yeah, I mean, I got that sense that he would go back and sit in the
Yeah,
same place and work on these small
yeah,
paintings because they really are finished. They're small, but they're really finished and beautiful, beautiful. I mean, he could paint so well. His technical prowess with on a tiny
yeah.
scale was just amazing.
No, they're
And
lovely.
also on the bigger scale, his bigger paintings, you look at little sections of them, and they're just beautiful paintings in themselves
Yeah.
in these tiny little sections. My God, Constable could paint, couldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, do you have did you expect did you have a favorite going in, and did it stay that way when you came out? I mean, I know a lot of people have come away thinking they kind of they decided they preferred Constable over Turner. I don't actually, but
I
what was your
have.
take on it?
I'm more impressed in general with Turner. I
Hmm.
think as a career, he got to, he sort of invented Impressionism. And then
Hmm.
you get to late career Constable and you think he's really, what's he doing here? He's daubing white paint on, that painting of Waterloo Bridge. It's just
Hmm.
awful. It's just awful. And his late work really doesn't really succeed. Whereas Turner's late work is sort of as close as you can get to God, really. I mean, Norham Castle Sunrise
No,
is one of
it's an amazing
my
picture.
favorite paintings of all time. It's just as close to painting spirituality as I think
Mm.
I've ever seen in works of art.
I think what's interesting as well. I mean, we're thinking about this idea of tensions in their work and modernity and tradition and so on. I think the other part that's interesting with Turner is a lot of painters, and let's say even in the 20th century, you mentioned Impressionism. Even later on, he's often connected to people like Mark Rothko. I
Mm.
say the really significant difference, not so much with Monet, but particularly with Rothko, is that I mean Turner is really painting the effect of light on surfaces, whether it's water and the sky. And so, even though there is unmistakably an abstract element to his compositions, and he's not delineating things, he's not painting form, but he's always painting the effect of light, and very very specific. It's meant to be. You always know if it's morning, afternoon, evening. You absolutely know that, and that
Like
is
the
the exact
Petworth
that.
House series,
Yeah,
the Petworth House series,
and
they
that's
are
that,
just
that's the
they're
exact
just
opposite of
sunsets.
abstract painting. I mean, to
No.
paint the specific effect of a moment of light is the least abstract thing you can possibly do.
Mm.
It contains abstract elements, undoubtedly, as all great painting does, but it's not abstract painting. He's painting the effect of light on specific surfaces at a very specific moment, and that's
Well, it's a kind of impressionism for sure, but
yeah,
it's definitely
absolutely, it's
not abstract.
impressionism.
But it's funny, when you try and paint a sunset, people love sunsets, they take pictures of
Hmm.
sunsets, it's a magical time of the day. But to actually paint a successful sunset is very
Hmm.
difficult. And Turner could do that. He seemed to be able to do it with ease.
I mean, I think it's connected a little bit to when he. I mean, there are a lot ever since. I mean, one of the things that photography does is to freeze something that's moving. So let's say painting and photography struggle in the same way to really convey movement. If you're taking a photograph of, let's say, a Formula One car, you either have to have the car blurred or the background blurred. There's no other way to create movement, and painting has a very similar challenge to explain movement, whereas cinema has a different set of possibilities.
Mm.
And I think one of the things that, since photography, when people paint, let's say, the ocean or a storm, and they're there painting all the little pieces of the froth and the water and everything else, and in the end, what it doesn't actually do is to convey the energy and the force and the dynamic movement of what it feels like to be in a boat or to be out on a moorland in the storm. And what I think Turner understood so well was the essential. And you can look at it in the same, some of these vortexes you find in Leonardo's drawings as well. He understood, even before scientific, profound scientific analysis of those things, he understood the essential energy of those things. It's diagonal lines, swirling vortexes. And
Yeah,
even though it doesn't
the ship
necessarily
in the
look like it doesn't look in a photographic sense like a wave, you absolutely know what it is. I mean, it is a wave. It doesn't look like a wave. It is a wave.
no, I call it hyper real, which is not photo real.
No, it's
Photo
beyond.
real is a
It's
different thing. Photo real is something that I hate in painting,
mm-hmm.
but it's so much paint, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes more than real. Sort of metaphysically, it's more real than reality.
No, I mean, I think in figure painting, I think the way that Rembrandt approaches the human body and the sort of the way Rembrandt paints skin, and then the way that Turner paints air or moving water, they would have had a connect. I mean, they might have hated each other. They're both pretty difficult people, but I think they were doing something similar. In the sense of, as you say, through the use of paint, it becomes the thing. It's not a painting of something. It becomes that thing which it's depicting, and that's glorious.
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, I want to talk about late Turner paintings because obviously he's so famous for his late work and how it influenced Monet. Monet came to London,
Yeah.
historically came to London and started painting impressionistic paintings, very influenced from Turner's paintings on the River Thames. How did he get there? How did Turner get to that late stage in his career? There is a story that after this exhibition, this famous exhibition in 1831, where Constable was the new fashionable man on the scene, Turner sort of said, "Screw this, screw the
Yeah.
RA. I'm going to go and do my own thing. I've got my own clientele. I've got my own collectors. I've got enough
Mm-hmm.
money. I don't need the RA anymore." And
No.
he sort of left it all behind. I mean, do you think that that's what happened, or do you think something else was going
Yeah, I
on?
mean, I think what you touched on is very valid. I think I think the comparison, there's a large part of your heart and being which is Venetian, and I think there are parallels also to the evolution that happened in, say, Titian's career as well. I think thinking about other artists who are performing, not painters, but if you think about what was happening to someone like Beethoven, very much that moment as well. And Beethoven's probably the most romantic of all of the composers. He was writing in the Pastoral Symphony, the second. There's the storm that happens in it, and then the way that his own music became more broken, more atonal, less conventional and classical in its form. And I think
Yeah, and
there are a
also, I
number
mean,
of there.
if we get to Titian, late Titian is very impressionistic too.
Mhm.
So it's not like Turner invented
No,
this impressionistic thing. Impressionism has an impression is kind of a good painting, but he's pushing the boundaries. He's pushing
absolutely.
what's possible with the paint. He has such a command of oil paint.
Hmm.
He's almost using oil paint like watercolor in his late work, and he's really pushing paint as far as it can
Yeah.
go.
No, I think he also gave us this idea that just the relationship between. I mean, Debussy does something similar in music, but it's like there's just this relationship between color and feeling.
Hmm.
And even Titian, like black was never not on his palette.
No.
Sometimes even you can see even in late Velasquez, there's even two blacks, like a warm and a cool one. And Titian, sorry,
Well,
so obvious.
if you compare Titian to Tintoretto, Tintoretto's
Hmm.
using lots of black.
Yeah,
Titian less so much.
but it's
But
still, but if you take a black and white photograph of, say,
mm,
of a Titian at any stage in his career, it still makes sense in terms of light and dark. And you suddenly see
tonally.
these
Mm,
Turner paintings where, in some cases, if you were to take a black and white photograph of them, they'd be completely illegible. I mean, they just wouldn't make any sense.
mm,
And that's where he moves past that Claude Lorraine thing. And Claude Lorraine was creating paintings to be made into engravings. That their black and white structure is so solid, so
mm,
complex, and so beautiful. And by the end of his career, Turner's moved into the thing where it's not that he's using paint straight from the tube, but he's using pretty direct color in a way it's a direct appeal to to the sense through. He's appealing to our intellect, but above all else to our emotions through the senses. And
But
that's very.
how do you think he's got there? Do you think it's just a natural progression? It's a command of his materials. He's got there in a natural sense. Do you think he something influenced him in life? What was it
I
exactly?
mean,
What's your impression?
obviously now we have we live in a computer age, and people's eyes do, it's pretty noticeable. Even before computers, people's eyes started to deteriorate to some degree at about the age of 40.
Hmm.
And so I think there's a strong likelihood that he simply didn't see as sharply, or his sense of understanding of focus works slightly differently, and then rather than suffer from that, he decided to sort of heroically blast through it and actually turn it into an advantage, or to turn it into an integral part of his process. And
But also, as you know, it becomes such a discipline. It becomes such a routine in life. Painting, it's such muscle memory that you have to do it.
mhm.
You have
So
to
he was
wake
an
up and do
artist,
it.
and
You
he
feel
couldn't do
empty in
anything
your
else.
life if you don't. So, however it comes out, you still have to try to go for
No,
something.
I mean, Beethoven was deaf, and and that late music is much more, let's say, rather than it being, classical controlled, it becomes, he's looking for what's essential in something, and I think that's what Turner's really looking for, is to say that. I think there's a difference between something being detailed and being specific, and so I'd say his paintings become less detailed, but they become no less specific as he gets
Mm.
older. He knows, and he's in total control of what you're going to feel as a result of looking at it. It's not as if he's trying to paint day and it feels like night.
And he also returns to a lot of the subjects.
Yeah.
Norham Castle, famously, he
Hmm.
painted over and over again. Certain Venetian scenes he painted over and over again. But
Yeah.
those late works are completely impressionistic compared to the
Yeah.
detail and
Absolutely.
the
He's not counting the windows anymore, kind of thing. It's like, if
no.
you think about. Um, I mean, I'm always thinking of other great landscape painters in Italy. I've always found that, like, Canaletto paintings, they look like Venice to the extent that all the windows are in the right place. But when I see those big grand ones of the Grand Canal or St. Mark's Basin, it doesn't actually look like Venice in terms of the light and the sense of atmosphere. It looks like a sort of a concept of Venice seen through. In Venice, the shadows don't have that brownness to them. They have a kind of a grayness and a purpleness depending on the time of day and the time of year. But they don't have that kind of old world brownness that Canaletto gives them in a lot of cases. The windows are in the right place, but it's not the light of Venice. Turner goes the other way, where he's saying, "I'm going to give you the light of Venice, but if you want the windows, stop being such a pedant."
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's a very Lucian Freud thing to say, but Lucian Freud was very much a Constable man, and he
Mm-hmm.
said that he
Yeah.
liked he preferred Constable more because he
Mm-hmm.
got to the truth of things more. Whereas, as you
I'd say
say,
there's.
Turner is sort of impressionistic and painting from his imagination and creating atmosphere.
I think there's a really. I mean, I understand what Lucian Freud's getting. I think he's missing something in the sense of, I would say there's a really important distinction between truth and reality. So let's say an opera or a Shakespeare play. Even in Shakespeare's day, people didn't speak to each other in that way, and we certainly don't sing at each other. I mean, luckily for our listeners, neither of us are singing to each other. In my case, it would be completely horrible. Um, but yet, when you listen to a beautiful opera or a really good opera production, there is a truth in it, because it's about human relationships. It's about the motivations of a character. It's not reality, because we don't sing, we don't speak in blank verse. But underneath all of that artifice is a truth.
Mm,
And I think Constable is an artist who is probably almost more interested even in reality than necessarily truth. There's a truth that comes out of all of these small observations of the reality around him.
mm,
Turner's more in that operatic, poetic sense of it. You have to accept that there's a. It's not about, let's say, a visual or an immediate obvious reality, but contained underneath there is a. When you stand on top of the mountain, you feel something, and you
mm,
feel the grandeur of nature. You'll feel the swoop of the sky. You'll feel the energy of the storm,
mm.
and that's just as true, even if the reality of the sea might be different.
I mean, I completely agree with that. Very Lucian Freud was sort of obsessed with the animal and the human. And,
Mm-hmm.
I think art is all about transcending. I mean, I think life is all about transcending.
Yeah, you can have both.
You transcend through your children, you transcend through art. When you listen to music, you transcend out of this animal form that we are. And that's why art is so important. That's why people love it
Mm-hmm.
so much. But Turner does that on such a level that I just haven't seen painting that gets to that
Mm-hmm.
transcendence on such a level with that late work. But like you say, that there is an incredible truth to Constable
Yeah,
as
I mean, I
well
think
that's
that,
just as powerful.
and I think when I mean, it wasn't in that show. One of the ones that Lucian Freud always loved was this painting he did of a kind of a tree stump or a tree bark, and you really, I mean, it's almost like some of those great Russian 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century painters where it's painted very physically, which I think Freud responded to as well. I mean, his surfaces are not. I mean, he glazed a little bit, but it's really there's quite a thick, um, visceral, heavy use of paint in a lot of those Constable things. I thought what I love with that Hadley Castle one is that there's a description of Raphael saying not just that Raphael painted nature, but his hand moved like nature. And when you look at the little passages in the Hadley Castle, I just love that section where the little tower casts a shadow down over the bank. And
Mm.
then there are these little patches of grass and rocks and other things that move in and out of the shadow. And he's not
Oh,
painting the
there's
things.
passages in Constable paintings
Oh,
that
it's amazing.
I looked at much more closely than the Turner ones. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there are beautiful, of course, beautiful passages in Turner paintings too, like the Fifth Plague of Egypt, which was the
Yeah.
only one behind the screen,
Mm-hmm.
and it won the Royal Academy show in 1800. It was. Um, and he painted that at 25
Yeah.
years old. I mean,
No.
just incredible. That was a very, very, very powerful piece with these incredible passages of
Yeah.
paint. But his later work is very simple.
Mm-hmm.
The passages aren't as interesting. He's going for something else.
Yeah.
But you go to these Constable and these tiny passages of paint. He's sort of scraping the brush across the surface, the dry oil paint across the surface, and creating this texture and these amazing. Just I could endlessly look at them. I was taking
Mm-hmm.
small photos of these
Mm-hmm.
tiny parts of the paintings and the canvases all over the show. It was so
Yeah.
impressive to see on at that scale.
And the other person, I think, I mean, they've recently restored the National Gallery. It was in the National Collection when Constable and Turner were working, and that it's the large Rubens landscape in the National Gallery of Hetstein, his house. And when there's a guy, if people are on Instagram, there's a guy called Larry Keith who's the National Gallery's restorer, and there are these little sections where he's painting the grass and some of the birds and other things. And I think it's very obvious that Constable was so interested in that paint application. He was really fascinated by the way that Rubens's hand works. It's for someone like Rubens, who when he painted flesh could be very polished and highly finished. When you look at some of the if you go to the National Gallery, if you're in the UK, and you look at the bottom right hand corner of that painting, I mean it's completely wild, and it's so similar.
But I know what you mean. There's a sense that you can walk into that painting,
Yeah,
and there's a sense you can walk into the Constable
yeah,
paintings.
and there's a physicality to the paint as well. I mean it's not as compared to some of the more sort of polished Rubens figures. I think there's obviously something. He's painting his own house and the landscape around it, which is also very much like what Constable's doing too. And so I think the parallels. Claude is this kind of mystical figure who's giving them a lot in terms of composition, at different stages in their careers. But at that, I think for Constable, those Rubens landscapes were also really important, not just for the composition, but actually for the physicality of the paint handling as well. And yeah, if you have the chance, and there's a little in the bottom right hand corner of the Rubens, there's this little bird, which it's got a little sort of red breast, a bit of blue, and some other things, and it's painted with such freedom, such suggestiveness, and also just such joy. I think Rubens was one of like the happiest painters. About like every painting is just like a harvest festival of
And Constable's a
happiness.
similar thing. I mean, that's a very interesting connection that you've made there. I never have made that
Mm-hmm.
connection, and I completely agree. I completely see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's a definite connection to. I'm sure he was looking at
Oh
Rubens'
yeah,
landscapes, especially.
particularly the landscapes. I mean, then there are other. I mean, I think Constable was, I think, probably in the end a happier person. I mean, Turner, I think, became very, dark and disillusioned with, sort of, I guess, that moment in history where suddenly we were aware of all these sort of horrible things that humans were doing to each other, and I think it affected Turner a lot more. I mean, they were the French Revolution had failed, and there was an emperor in power. Okay, he'd been defeated, but this moment at the end of the 18th century where we really thought that we're going to create this kind of fair and new world, and then you get this moment where people realize that actually we're just going to make the same mistakes again and again and again. And there are just particular paintings, I think, where Turner's just sort of fighting that. Not negativity is the wrong word, but just there's a sadness, I think, that came in that moment in the sort of the last part of the early 19th century, and Turner's really one of those spirits who felt it very profoundly.
I agree with you, and I think Turner was thinking at that scale. He did have a very big vision.
Yeah,
Whereas when you look at Constable, you think he's just Little England. He's very happy with his little
yeah,
patch and just painting it over and over again. You
yeah,
definitely do get that sense. Turner wanted to go and look at Rome. He wanted to
yeah,
paint and look at these great European works of art. I
yeah.
mean, I'm not sure if you remember in one of his sketchbooks,
Yeah,
there's
the Titian.
the drawing of Titian
Yeah,
of the entombment, which I just thought was an
yeah.
amazing thing. He was really trying to work it out in his sketchbook, writing notes and annotations about how Titian painted it.
No, the
Um,
commentary was very lucid too. I mean, it's one of those things where you thought, he's really looking at this as someone, he'd studied, he'd done it. He wasn't. He really wanted to be a figure painter as well. I mean, in the end, he's not known for his figure painting because they're not on the level of other people who did, you know. And he was in an age where so many people were being taught to draw the human form to a highly competent level.
oh yeah, I mean, portrait painting at that time in
Yeah,
England was the greatest in the world. We were dominating at that time
yeah,
from a country that had not had a particularly great tradition of portrait painting. By that time in history, in art history, we were number one in
yeah,
Europe through the influence of Anthony van Dyck. But that's sort of another story. And you're
yeah.
right, Turner, he does kind of want to paint for figurative work, but it
And things.
never
I mean,
really succeeds.
no, I mean there are a couple of they weren't in the show, but if you go to the Tate, there are a couple of these kind of like reclining nudes, and there are a few moments. There's that one of Hannibal crossing the Alps in the exhibition. There are some figures in the foreground. They're not big, but they're there were 100 people painting in his time easily, probably more, just in London alone, let alone Paris or any of the other great, Munich, anywhere in Italy, who could paint who would have painted those figures better than him. But that's not really the point. I think to if you ask an elephant to be a giraffe, you'll be, and I think, in that same way, to ask the public to decide. I mean, of course, it's fun to say, who do you prefer, Turner or Constable? But as I said, I'm a really greedy person. I think it would be if you then had to kind of just get rid of the other person if you're making that decision and say, I will no longer consider the other artist. Well, no, what a stupid thing to have to ask people to do.
Well, that's one of the things with the exhibition, and I mean, I have to, I know it's very selfish of me, but
Mm-hmm.
I always find it so frustrating going to these exhibitions and having hundreds of people. I mean, of course, they're for the public to see.
Yeah,
It's of cultural importance. The public
yeah, it's
must see
great.
this stuff, but it's also very difficult to take in. You have a
Mm-hmm.
moment with a painting, you're trying to take it in. It's exhausting. If you had to leave that exhibition with one painting, would it be a Turner painting or would it
Yeah,
be a
it'd be a
Constable
turning
painting?
paint. It's one of a storm, and there's a kind of a boat, and then there's a kind of, I think it's a setting sun rather than a rising sun off to the side. It was in one of the last rooms. It's quite a grey picture with that little note. I mean, it's browns and greys. It's almost like a Velasquez palette in a
Mm,
strange way. And I just, you could, it's almost infinite actually, and it's so.
mm,
What I love about it, I think it's a kind of picture where you look at and you think a lot of the paint on this canvas. There are certain moments where like things happened by accident, but nothing stayed by accident on that painting.
yeah.
If you would have put 3 or 4 brushstrokes together, and the effect of that wet paint moving amongst themselves or creating translucencies and transparencies with existing paint, it's not predictable. No matter how much experience you have, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. But equally, he could have changed any of it, and you can see that there are lots of adjustments being made. So much of that canvas happened by mistake, but nothing stayed by mistake. And I think that's I always love looking at paintings where you get that sensation.
And also, the surface of the canvases is always very unified. It's always a
Mm-hmm.
sign of a good painter. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people think that Rembrandt just slapped paint
No.
down, and of course, it's very textured, but it's very unified surface, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
you can. That's an easy way to kind of see great master work.
Yeah,
Um,
there's variety, but it's not this kind of mad lumps
no.
and other things. And there's a logic to it. There's a reason for it as
There's a
well.
logic, there's a unification to it, and
Yeah.
that's how it works. If you've got something jumping out at you, yeah, sure, you can have a highlight jump out here and
Mm-hmm.
there to create a little bit of variation, but there's a unification always to Turner's work, like you see in Rembrandt's. And
No, and, he moves from areas where the paint's quite thin to other areas where it's quite thick, but there's a rhythmical,
yeah,
in the same way that a line moves rhythmically, that actually the paint surface itself also moves with a rhythm of, large.
like the famous painting, "The Fire Over the River Thames" that Turner
Yeah.
painted. That's a great example of it. There's obviously thicker parts where the fire is and thinner parts around the side. But there's this. It works as a visual image. It works as
Yeah.
a painting, and that's very difficult to do. I mean, as a painter and yourself as a painter, you know how difficult it is to execute these things and make them look successful.
No, no, it's yeah. I think they both. I mean, Turner in particular had certain kind of tricks that you can see him employing in lots of pictures. So people always talk about the light in Turner's paintings and that sense of luminosity. And something that you notice in a lot of his paintings is the middle of the painting really is where not exactly in the center like bullseye, but the lighter parts of the painting are generally towards the center, and then the corners get a little bit darker. He
Yeah,
very
and
rarely
there's
has.
also a very waxy surface to a lot of
Mhm,
them. They weren't wasn't that high shiny glaze on a lot of the Turner, especially the late work.
mhm.
Was he using a wax
I
varnish
mean,
or what
I
was
think
it?
also actually that there's a degree to which some of those later paintings as well, we don't know whether they were actually completely finished. I mean, there's art historians, one of those, that's one of those debates that will rage forever. But I think it's quite telling that lots of them are just simply not varnished, and that kind of tells you that he didn't see them as complete. Lots of his later work is varnished, and that tells you that one is, in that case that it's likely to be finished. Famously, the Impressionists were among the first painters to, almost as a sort of as a religious credo, did not varnish their work.
Mm.
And if you're not using black, it's possibly not even necessary. It's really the black in the colors that necessitates the varnish.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it can dry very dull, and can
Yeah,
look
I mean,
very
I'm like
flat.
that. I did go through a period of high varnish. I'm now going through a period
Mm-hmm.
of not using that much varnish.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends what part of the journey you're on in your in
Yeah,
your
I mean,
paintings.
if I'm painting outside, I don't use so much black. But if I'm painting portraits and figures in my studio, then I use black, and therefore there's no way you have to varnish the pictures. Otherwise, they'll look pretty washed out, and the colors that you're mixing into those darker areas just won't resonate in the same way. But as you say, there's this kind of the other thing that's frustrating. Thanks to these people that throw super paintings. Turner in particular, it'd be so wonderful to see those without glass on them.
Yeah.
And there's, if you go, I remember going to the
You mean the
Prado.
oil protesters that go and throw
Yeah,
super
yeah. And so
masterpieces?
obviously now museums have to take precautions and cover everything in glass, but it makes a really intimate technical analysis of the surface very, very difficult because you're looking at it. It's like visiting someone in prison rather than talking to them really face to face, across a dinner table or sitting next to them on a sofa. It is just a more sterile experience, and I'm sure lots of people think about the environment and what's going to happen in 100 years' time, but you do occasionally think there might be more productive ways to go about making that point than throwing super really beautiful paintings. And the poor frames that are caught up in there go, oh no, the painting's fine, it's behind glass, but some of the frames that are damaged are really wonderful works of art in their own right.
Does it really get that much support? Like, do people want to join the cause after seeing them
Um,
throw a super a masterpiece? I mean, I certainly don't. I mean, Greta Thunberg recently went to Venice and threw a load of green dye in the Grand Canal. I just thought that was abusive. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Why are you going and putting your ego on a place that's, ancient, timeless, beautiful? Go and do it in another way. Use your imagination.
yeah, I think everyone recognizes that the looking after our environment is an incredibly important thing, and you see it in those paintings. I mean, they're not paintings of they're not actively paintings of protest. I think there's a danger that people kind of impose a 21st century narrative on these things. But it's very clear that, particularly in Constable's case, that he really cares about the places that he paints. As you're saying, he's painting the bark on the trees. He's really making sure that the poles that run along the canal, those are those poles.
Mm.
I'm sure he
And
adjusts certain things for compositional reasons, but he really, he's it's almost like he's painting the portrait of like his wife or something in a way that this is a person I love. When Rubens paints his wife, and people go, oh, why did he put the cellulite on the thighs? Like, no, he loves her body. It's an act of,
mm,
he's not trying to pretend that everything's perfect, but love isn't about that. And you really feel that with Constables. That's probably why Freud responded to it. It's got that tactile quality that you feel, you
mm,
reach out and physically touch those things. Your fingers will get wet. If you put your finger there, it'll get wet. If you put your finger there, you'll have dew on it. And I think it's an act of. There's a nice bit in Kenneth Clark wrote a book on landscape painting, much less known than Civilization or The Nude or whatever.
Mm.
Actually, there's in one of the chapters he says facts become art through love, and I've always thought that was a rather beautiful way of describing the care that a painter might take. And I think when you look at those Constable pictures of these places that he knew so well, you really sense that he loved them. I mean,
Mm.
Turner loves light. It almost doesn't matter. You could put Turner anywhere, and if it's the right
Mm.
time of day, the right light effect, he'd make a painting out of it. He could be a stranger. He could have just arrived, and he'll find. If the effect is right at the time of day is there, he's your Constable. Needs to be there for a year or 3 or 4 months. But when he finds that angle, when he finds that combination of textures and sort of things and physical sensations that he can describe with paint, no, I mean, he's an amazing artist.
And the different textures. I mean, that's what
Yeah,
makes a still life painter will do a
yeah,
shiny surface, a dull surface, a glass cloth, and he sort of does that
yeah,
with his
absolutely.
landscapes too. There's all
Yeah.
kinds of different surfaces and
Mm-hmm.
textures and things that he's getting, and this vibration comes across in the most profound way. But we've talked about late Turner. Let's get to late Constable because
Mm-hmm.
like I say, I think I don't understand really what he's doing in his late works. He's daubing
Mm-hmm.
on white peats, white paint. It's like a snow blizzard. I
Well,
think,
it's famously known as Constable Snow.
yeah. I mean, but I think Turner made that up. I think Turner had a
Mm-hmm.
quite sharp tongue and made that up in quite a offhand, funny way though.
Yeah.
But they're odd, aren't they? Do you like them? Do you like his late
Um,
paintings?
no, not as much. I mean, I think I think he always had. I mean, what I think is interesting is if you look for a thread that combines every great painter, way beyond whether they're painting landscapes or still lives or whatever else, and you might like or dislike the style, you might like or dislike the palette. What every great painter pretty much never got wrong was that they were all great composers. And I think
Mm.
compositionally, even if, as you say, some of these sort of little kind of these endless little white highlights and some of the almost like texture becoming a mannerism rather like it becomes an imposition on the subject rather than a response to it. But
But
the linear design of space and the distribution of moments of interest, I think he's still a great composer, even if, as you say, I struggle to connect with
I
those
think you're
late
being
works in the
very,
same
very
way.
fair. I think I really think they're bad. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think they're awful. I was really going up close to them, thinking, "What on earth is he thinking? Where's what? How is he getting to this place? Because it's just not working, and it's bizarre."
I mean, the thing I struggle with, I guess, is I always feel Constable's at his best when the scene is humble.
Yeah,
And a lot of those later works, actually, he's painting these kind of very grand ceremonies on the River Thames and these big moments. And I think he was just, I wouldn't say out of his depth, but I think it was his own pictorial language was very unsuited to those types of scenes. And you
mm,
combine the fact he was getting older, and again, eyesight, spectacles, glasses, contact lenses then were not what they are today. So maybe he saw things. If you were to squint at those paintings, they look slightly more kind of comprehensible, and maybe his eyesight meant that he was essentially squinting at his own paintings rather than we're always taught to squint at your subject but look at your painting, and maybe
yeah,
he was effectively squinting at his own work as well.
yeah. Maybe it was a physical thing rather
Yeah.
than an actual visual.
But I think that his subject matter for him, he didn't. He was a very humble. You get the feeling that he liked these humble scenes. He said, the reason I became a painter was to paint wet wood and
Mm.
grass. That those scenes of sort of grand processions at Waterloo Bridge. I mean, that's the polar opposite of the reason he became a painter.
No, yeah, they
And
don't quite work. Yeah.
it's like when you see if you were to see I don't know like Jacob Rees-Mogg wearing a football shirt, it would just be like, what are you doing? Um, and there's an element of that in you just feel that he's slightly not out of his depth, I think is the wrong word, but he's he didn't have a pictorial language that suited that didn't suit that type of scene. And yeah, there's a kind of an awkwardness there, and then they're definitely not as I
But
don't know the
Turner,
word.
Turner, Turner would go to Europe and he would go and see these great paintings, and he had this visual language and visual knowledge
Mhm.
that he used, and it informed his painting,
Yeah.
and it did progress. Whereas Constable didn't leave England, did he?
No, I mean there
He
was a
stayed
bit
very
like
close to home.
Rembrandt
He,
never left Amsterdam, but
no, that's
there's a lot
true.
of stuff in Amsterdam. And I think you can tell that Constable did look at a lot of the paintings that were in London. But no, as you say, he never.
I'm saying
Yeah,
maybe he got stuck. That's my
yeah.
point. Maybe he just got a bit stuck. And
I mean, I think there's this is where sometimes where someone's, let's say, that comfortable social background that maybe Turner at one point was jealous of.
mm,
Yeah, he wasn't a rich man, but he always had just enough that he didn't have to really strive. And maybe he was maybe one of those people that just to some degree felt comfortable and didn't feel it was
he
necessary
was like
to.
Freud. Lucian Freud always had money. I
Yeah,
mean, his grandfather was Sigmund Freud.
yeah,
There was money there. It wasn't like he was wealthy, but
no,
he could afford a place to live and
yeah,
always and go out and eat food.
yeah.
Whereas
And you could
Turner,
take Britain.
if Turner's career didn't go well, it was back to the barbershop and
Yeah,
sweeping up.
he didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of hunger and desire for something, that sort of scrappiness, was also, what was at one point in his career was a disadvantage. And you say when you look at Turner's early work, you can see that he's kind of almost trying to force it. He wants,
Mm.
I mean, I think we can kind of easily impose a 21st century narrative. It's not like he's kind of going on Big Brother to get notorious, but there's an element where he's jumping around trying to find the thing that will unlock the next career rung. And then
Absolutely.
at a certain point, as you said earlier, it's like, are those late paintings him being pure him? Is it his failing eyesight? Is it a combination of lots of these different things, philosophical and artistic trends that are running around Britain and Europe at the time? And I think it's all of those things together are what came together in his, to help explain his late work. And I think, yeah, it's
No, and I think you make a good point with Constable that he didn't have that pressure. He didn't have that financial pressure. So he could take longer to find
mm,
that language, to find his own language, to go to the same places and paint over and over again. And he certainly did find his own visual language. I mean, yeah, it's just
I mean, I
incredible.
think there are some constables I think that I find, you don't like those late ones, and I struggle with them a little bit too. I also find some of even the early ones at times they're quite boring. I mean, it's just like it's a
Mm,
little house and a tree, and you think, I mean, it's beautifully painted, but yeah, and I mean, there
mm,
are a couple which are. I mean, I mean, banal is probably a bit too rude, but they're very kind of polite,
mm.
and I
Well,
think,
he didn't become a Royal Academician until he was 51.
yeah.
So it took him a while to get going.
But those big. I mean, when you look at, I think Hadley Castle is just a great landscape painting, and to have it there with the 6 footer, that's it's place, it's space, it's air, it's rocks and trees and water, but it's also it's such an emotional picture. You look at it and you feel turbulent. You can't. I think it's very hard to stand in front of that painting and not be moved. I don't find the Haywain as emotionally affecting. In general, I find I feel a greater range of things, and I feel I'm lifted more in the presence of Turner. But when I stand in front of the Hadley Castle, it's impossible not to feel something. I mean,
And as a
it's such
painter,
a powerful painting.
you're looking at the technical prowess and thinking, wow, that
Both,
really is
actually, yeah,
great to
both.
look
I mean,
at. Yeah.
just as a person as well, and you can the broken column or the broken castle. In portraits, the broken column is a sign of someone in mourning, and it's so clear the broken castle is an emblem of, it's connected to that idea. And then
Mm,
you read about the fact that he painted this when he was mourning his wife's death, and the connection becomes, you can't miss it.
no, and
Um,
he had a great love affair with his wife, didn't he?
yeah,
Mm,
and so when you think, okay, there are these sort of semi-sunlit paintings of Suffolk and of Salisbury, and then but he also had, I think, range is such an interesting thing with a painter. I really am drawn to artists who try to, think about Lucian Freud. I think he painted introverted misery really well, but there aren't that many other emotions that you feel when you're looking at his paintings.
mm.
He's
And
brilliant at that.
famously, when he was going through really difficult periods in his life, he painted landscapes. He did
Yeah.
these landscapes of his backyard, basically, with a very
But
intricate.
I mean, they're all quite sort of, the plants are quite dead as well. I mean, nothing,
Mm,
there aren't that many. He had a blue sky Lucian Freud paintings.
yeah,
Um,
no, there's none.
I mean, everything's in sort of B flat minor, and that's great. I mean, you give him that, and he did it really, as well as anyone in the 21st century. But then, think about someone like a Titian, and there are paintings which are grim, paintings which are happy, paintings which are tender, paintings which are violent. I
Yeah,
think
and
what's so
Rembrandt,
wonderful with,
he's touched every sort of
yeah,
thing. He's done everything. I mean, you could compare him to a writer like Leo Tolstoy.
yeah, exactly.
Tolstoy touches on everything: the poor, the rich, death, marriage, love, hate, war, peace. Obviously, Shakespeare's similar too.
And I think
Tom,
that's what I love about that Constable is you see these other paintings which are more kind of, um, I mean, there are a few sort of stormy-ish kind of skies. I mean, famously, the vicar in Salisbury didn't like the big storm cloud behind the cathedral. But I mean, it doesn't have the emotional resonance of the Hadley Castle, and I think it's one of those. It's such an important painting for Constable because it tells you that he had this emotional, psychological, and technical range that perhaps otherwise you wouldn't necessarily be so aware of when some of the little sketches you can see him doing storm clouds and stuff, but he's bringing all of those things together in that painting, and for me, in terms of when I think about Constable, that's almost the first one I go to. It's that one. I really think it's such a powerful and moving piece. Turner, I've always loved. I mean, interesting. If you were a young artist and you'd say, okay, if you're telling someone to copy a painting, I would actually think it's probably easier to copy a Constable. The paint's a little bit more direct. You can see more or less the color that's been mixed in the brushstroke. Turner's combining semi-transparent layers, so it's like trying to copy a Rembrandt. Basically, it's like there's a technical complexity that's so,
and an eccentricity to it that's hard to know where to go.
But I think, as I said, the exhibition asks you to choose, and I understand that it's a nice marketing tool, but I don't want to.
You say you would leave with a Turner with a Turner painting, but you've talked about Constable's Hadley Castle more than any other painting in this.
I mean, that Turner one, the Turner of the Storm. I went with a friend, someone we both know, who was, and that actually in the end when we said at the end, which one are you walking out with? We both said that one. I think to live with on a day-to-day basis, I think it's both its its emotional impact just on a human or psychological level, but then it's the mystery of its technique. You could just be looking into these surfaces, and as in a museum setting, obviously it's quite a sterile thing because it's in a sort of a nuclear bunker with electric light on it. But if you had that on a wall, or imagine it in Turner's studio during the different times of day, different times of the year, with a different.
And also, it's just very unique. There's no real painting like that. It's a very unique,
they're amazing
piece.
Yeah. And again, it touches on some of the other themes that you've brought up, and we've been talking about this idea of it's the sailboat in an era where the steamboat's coming in, and so there's this modernity, nostalgia, tension in the work. So it's a moment in history, but it also is it's not just an illustration, and it's not a journalistic illustration. It's there's a timeless quality to it as well, and I think I mean, Constable is they're both of their time, but I think Turner, to me anyway, speaks a little bit, blasts through that specific moment to me with a little bit more consistency and power. But I love them both.
I love the fact that you quoted Turner, what apparently he said on his deathbed, that the sun is God. Do you think he said that? That's an amazing quote.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that as you say, he went to Rome, and obviously it's. He grew up in a Protestant country, England. He went to the Catholic country, but it's also it's a classical capital as well. And if you think of the sun god being Apollo, and if you in the Renaissance, there were even Nietzsche, this great contrast between Apollo and Dionysus. And actually, I think it'd be easy to think of Turner as being a Dionysian painter. It's less ordered, less structured. Apollo is the god of light. And even in his, again, there is this, there is a logic to Turner. When he's composing, he divides space in quite a mathematical way. So there's always this kind of, again, if you try to just put him into this wild man category, it doesn't actually stand up when you look at them. The compositions are very considered. There's so much editing happening. So he's really thinking. What you can imagine him being in his studio for hours on end, just looking at his painting and thinking about one or two marks. You could easily imagine him making one or two marks in a 3 or 4 hour painting session, and just that would be. He's actually a very contemplative person as well as a very emotional person.
For sure. Tom, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. We've covered so much.
Yeah.
I hope we covered most of the exhibition. It's been wonderful. We'll do it again. We'll do it on another subject. We'll find something else that we can talk about. And like I said, thank you so much for doing this.
Not at all. It was a pleasure, Nick. That was really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, man.
Bye.